Something impossible just happened at the heart of our solar system. The sun went silent. For a brief, eerie moment, its constant hum of radiation vanished, only to return with a strange new rhythm linked to an interstellar visitor. Subscribe now and tell us where you're listening from. It all began with a silence that should not have been. The story of what happened to our sun is not one of fire and fury, but of a quiet that shook the foundations of science. This is the story of the day the sun seemed to listen. We will call this first event the Sun Falls Silent. Across the solar system, 3 separate missions were watching our star. These spacecraft, built by different nations and designed for different tasks, all saw the same impossible thing at the exact same time. Their instruments, which measure the constant flow of energy from the sun, detected a perfect gap. It was a hole in the data, a moment of pure, uninterrupted quiet. This was not an explosion. It was not a solar flare, which is a massive burst of energy. It was the opposite. For a few minutes, it was as if a part of the sun had simply turned off. The constant hum of its energy, a sound we cannot hear but can always measure, was gone. Then, just as strangely as it vanished, the hum returned. But it was different. It was changed. When the scientists looked closely at the data, they saw the energy that came back was slightly shifted. It was a tiny change, almost too small to notice. But it was also incredibly precise. It was like a musical note that was now just a little bit higher in pitch. This tiny, exact change sent a shiver through the scientific community. It was a clue. It reminded them of something they had seen months before, something that happened when a strange object from another star system passed by the planet Mars. That object was named 3I Atlas. It was a visitor, a traveller from the space between the stars. The connection was too specific to ignore. The silence in the sun lasted for 11 minutes. During that time, the sun was quiet in one very specific type of light, one particular wavelength. When that light returned, it was not just shifted, it was stronger than before. It came back with more energy than it had when it left. Astronomers tried to give it a name. They called it an absorption anomaly. This is a scientific way of saying that something blocked a specific kind of light. Imagine looking at a rainbow and seeing one colour, like green, suddenly disappear for a moment. That is what happened to the light from the sun. Something had absorbed it, like a sponge soaking up water. The type of light that was affected was also a major clue. It was the exact same wavelength that scientists use to track objects moving between the stars. It was the frequency they used to watch things like 3I Atlas. It was as if the event was a message, written in a language that only astronomers who studied interstellar objects would understand. They searched for any natural explanation. Could a solar flare have caused this? No. A flare is an explosion, a release of energy, not a moment of silence. Could a jet of hot gas called plasma have done it? No. Plasma is messy and chaotic. This event was clean, precise, and perfectly quiet. No known natural event could explain this kind of specific silence. The data was checked and rechecked. The event happened at multiple observatories at the exact same moment. There was no delay. Light travels incredibly fast, but even at that speed it takes time to cross the vast distances of space. For all 3 spacecraft to see the same thing at the same instant meant the cause had to be huge. It had to be something so big it could affect a vast area of space all at once. Or it had to be something perfectly coordinated, something that could act on different places at the same time. It was then that the name 3I Atlas started appearing in secret reports. It was only the 3rd interstellar object humanity had ever detected. And from the beginning it had been strange. It did not behave like a normal comet. It seemed to break the rules of physics that we thought we understood. This object had already confused scientists. Comets are usually balls of ice and rock. When they get close to the sun, the ice turns into gas, creating a beautiful tail. This process should push the comet slightly, like a tiny rocket engine. But 3I Atlas was releasing gas without being pushed. It was as if the gas was coming from all sides at once, perfectly balanced. That was strange. Even more strangely, the object seemed to be heating up from the inside. Comets are cold. They're warmed by the sun. But 3I Atlas was giving off its own heat, a faint warmth that had no explanation. It was a cold rock in the dark of space that was somehow warm. Some scientists had an idea. Maybe 3I Atlas was surrounded by a thick cloud of magnetic dust. This cloud could be dense and powerful, It could act like a shield or a filter. Perhaps this magnetic cloud could dampen certain frequencies of light. It could absorb them just like a thick blanket can absorb sound. This could explain the silence. But other scientists were not convinced. The idea seemed too perfect. A natural cloud of gas and dust in space called plasma is usually messy. It loses its shape and structure very quickly. It is like a puff of smoke that spreads out and disappears. But the silence from the sun was a perfect, clean gap. It held its shape. It did not fade or get messy. It was a sharp, clear signal. The effects were not just in the light. The sun's output of solar wind also changed. The solar wind is a constant stream of tiny particles flowing out from the sun. During the event, the flow of this wind dropped by 4%. The sun's magnetic fields, the invisible lines of force that surround it, also showed strange and sudden changes. It was described by one scientist as a shock wave made of silence. It was a wave that spread outward from the sun, not of sound or energy, but of quiet. It moved at hundreds of kilometers per second, a ripple of nothingness expanding into the solar system. In the end, the scientists had no official answer. They carefully recorded all the data. They saved every number, every chart, every strange reading. They archived the event, and they gave it a safe, boring name. They called it an unresolved transient. It was their way of saying, something happened. We don't know what it was. We will study it later. But everyone who saw the data knew they had witnessed something profound. For the first time in human history, the sun did not just shine outward. It did not just push energy into the solar system. For a brief, impossible moment, the sun seemed to draw inward. It seemed to pause. It seemed to listen. This moment of quiet was only the beginning. It was the first note in a song that the entire solar system would soon learn. The silence ended, but what came next was even more mysterious. What followed was a new kind of sound, a rhythm that had never been heard before. In the hours that followed the great silence, something new emerged. Our story continues with the discovery of a new heartbeat in the cosmos. Hours after the strange solar gap closed, a new rhythm appeared. It came from the sun's radio noise. The sun is always making a kind of static, a hiss of random energy that fills our radio telescopes. But this was different. At first, it was very faint, like a tiny tremor in the background noise. But it was there, and it repeated with impossible precision. It was a pulse, a steady, repeating beat. Every 19 hours, a very narrow band of radio waves from the sun would get brighter, and then it would dim. It was like a cosmic metronome ticking with a perfect, steady rhythm. This was not natural. The static from the sun is random and messy. This new signal was clean and stable. It was too organized to be a coincidence. Engineers at the Deep Space Network immediately thought it was a mistake. They believed it must be interference from one of our own satellites. Our planet is surrounded by machines that are constantly sending and receiving signals. Sometimes, these signals can look like they're coming from space. So, they checked. They turned off certain transmitters. They pointed their telescopes to different parts of the sky. But the pattern remained. The signal was still there, a steady heartbeat coming from the direction of the sun. They called it the signal without a source. Over the next few days, the signal did not fade. Instead, it got sharper. It became clearer, holding its phase coherence. That is a scientific way of saying that the wave held its shape perfectly. Each pulse was an exact copy of the one before it. Imagine a series of ripples in a pond, where every single ripple is identical. That is what this signal looked like. This perfect coherence was another clue. It matched something the scientists had seen before. It matched the radio echoes they had observed around 3I Atlas when it passed by Mars months earlier. The data from that event had been archived, saved for later study. Now they pulled it out. They compared the new signal from the sun with the old echoes from 3I Atlas. When they put the two sets of data together, the alignment was nearly perfect. It was a match. The timing of the pulse was the final piece of the puzzle. The new rhythm from the sun repeated every 19 hours, and the known spin of 3I Atlas, the time it took to make one full turn, was also 19 hours. The two periods matched within a few seconds. The whispers among the scientists grew louder. There had to be a connection. Some scientists tried to find a natural explanation. Perhaps they thought 3i Atlas had a magnetized cloud around it. This cloud could resonate with the hot gas, the plasma of the Sun. Resonance is when a small, repeated push can cause a big effect. Think of pushing someone on a swing. If you push at just the right moment, with a steady rhythm, you can make the swing go very high with very little effort. Maybe 3i Atlas was pushing the Sun's plasma at just the right rhythm. The Sun sends out many different kinds of waves. Perhaps 3i Atlas was somehow catching one of these waves and amplifying it. It could be acting like a mirror, reflecting the Sun's own energy back at it. This could create a pulse, but there was a problem with this idea. Natural reflections scatter. They get weaker and messier the farther they go. This pulse did the opposite. With each repetition, it grew stronger. By the third day, the strength of the signal had doubled. It was no longer just a faint whisper in the radio noise. It was now strong enough to cause visible effects. Telescopes watching the Sun's outer atmosphere, called the corona, saw faint flickers of light. These flickers appeared across the corona, all in perfect time with the radio bursts. Light and magnetism were moving together. They were perfectly aligned with the repeating radio pulses. The Sun was not just making a sound, it was dancing to the beat. An organized, repeating pattern was taking hold of our star. When the scientists looked even closer at the structure of the pulse, they found something even more strange. Each pulse was not just a single burst of energy. It was made of 3 narrow peaks. The pattern was always the same: 3 peaks, then 2, then 1. This 3-2-1 pattern is very rare in nature, but it is very common in technology made by humans. It is a pattern that suggests mathematics. To some researchers, it even suggested design. Official memos were careful with their words. They avoided phrases like artificial modulation, which would mean a signal that was made by intelligence. Instead, they used safe scientific terms like non-thermal periodicities. This was their way of saying, there are repeating patterns that are not caused by heat, and we do not know why. They gathered more data. They looked at the polarization of the radio waves. Polarization tells you which way a wave is wiggling. The data showed that the wave rotated by 90 degrees every time the pulse peaked. This suggested that a rotating magnetic field was creating the signal. It was another link to 3i Atlas, which was known to be spinning. The picture was becoming clear, and it was deeply unsettling. The Sun and 3i Atlas were pulsing together. They were beating in almost perfect time, offset by only a tiny fraction of a percent. This suggested that they were not two separate things. They were a shared system, connected by an invisible force. It was like they were sharing a single source of energy. The best computer models could not explain it. They could not create a simulation that showed this perfect dialogue over millions of kilometers of empty space. The connection was too clean, too stable. After a week, the pulse stabilized. It became what scientists call a phase-locked emission. This means it was no longer just a pulse. It was a steady exchange of energy, a conversation between a star and a visitor. When the pulse peaked again, the Sun did something new. It released a tremor, but not a tremor of light or heat. It was a tremor of magnetism. The Sun answered 3i Atlas, and it answered with a frequency that, according to our understanding of the Sun, should not exist. What if our Sun, once thought to be a passive giant, is actually capable of listening and even responding? What if the entire solar system is just one big instrument, and something from beyond is learning to play it? The Sun had found a new voice, a new rhythm. But this was more than just a sound. It was about to become a sight to behold. What came next was a visual confirmation, a strange light that defied all explanation. Our story now moves to an event that astronomers began to call the Sun's strange mirror. Soon, the evidence was no longer hidden in radio signals or magnetic data. It became visible. Initial images of the Sun's outer atmosphere, its corona, showed a pulse of light. It was a wave of brightness that swept across the entire surface. This pulse brightened and then faded, and it did so on a precise schedule. It did not match any known solar cycle, like the 11-year sunspot cycle. It was on its own time. It was not a solar flare. It was not a heat wave. Scientists described it as a mirrored echo. The light in the corona was echoing the frequency of 3i Atlas. It was as if the interstellar visitor was singing a note, and the Sun was humming it back. At first, the analysts who saw the images thought they were errors. They believed something was wrong with the camera or the software, but then other observatories confirmed it. Telescopes in different parts of the world and in space all saw the same ripple of light. It was real. The corona, the sun's fiery crown, seemed to breathe. It was breathing in perfect rhythm with an object millions of kilometers away. This was not how the sun was supposed to behave. The surface of our star is a place of chaos. It is a storm of random flares and violent eruptions. But these new pulses were the opposite of chaos. They were ordered. They were symmetrical. One scientist wrote in a private note that they looked almost engineered. It was as if an invisible mirror was being held up to the sun. The light was not just getting brighter or dimmer. It was being redirected. It was being focused. This is a special effect called coherent backscattering. It is when light waves are reflected back in a very organized way, all moving in perfect step. Humans can create this effect in laboratories. We use carefully arranged mirrors and powerful lasers, but there are no mirrors in space. A new idea began to grow among the scientists. Perhaps 3i Atlas was surrounded by a dense shell, a shell made of charged dust. This dust cloud could be acting as a kind of moving lens. It could be catching the sunlight, focusing it, and reflecting it in an organized way. But for this to work, the lens would have to be huge. It would need to be hundreds of kilometers wide, and it would have to be completely invisible to our telescopes on Earth. This moving lens would do more than just reflect light. It would also shape magnetism. It could affect the hot gas of the sun, the plasma, just like a glass prism can bend and shape a beam of light. The theory was wild, but it fit the evidence. The Parker Solar Probe, a spacecraft flying closer to the sun than any other, detected something that supported this idea. It found a faint repeating twist in the magnetic fields. This twist was happening exactly where the ripple of light started. It was a tiny rotation in the magnetic field lines, and the timing of this rotation matched the spin of 3i Atlas perfectly. It was more evidence of synchronized motion, not random scattering. The sun and the visitor were moving together. This discovery raised an uncomfortable question. Was the sun simply being observed by this object, or was it being manipulated? Was 3i Atlas just a passive mirror, or was it actively shaping the sun's behavior? More evidence came in. There were subtle shifts in the solar wind data. The density of certain particles, called ions, was also changing. And these changes happened every 19 hours, in perfect time with the light pulses. Even the direction of the particle flow changed slightly. It was as if invisible pressure waves were moving between the sun and 3i Atlas. It looked like a feedback loop. A feedback loop is when two things affect each other. Imagine speaking into a microphone that is too close to a speaker. The sound from the speaker goes into the microphone, gets amplified, comes out of the speaker even louder, and goes back into the microphone again. This creates a loud, high-pitched squeal. It is a loop of cause and effect. This is what seemed to be happening between the sun and the interstellar traveller. Publicly, the event was called a coronal reflection event. It was a safe scientific name. But in their internal reports, the scientists used a different term. They called it mirror coupling. This name suggested a much deeper connection. It implied that the sun was not just shining, it was responding. And with each cycle, the mirrored glow on the sun's corona grew stronger. The feedback loop was amplifying itself. The sun, a star that has always looked outward, that has always pushed energy away from itself, was for the first time in its long life reflecting on itself. The light it was sending out was coming back to it, organized and focused. It was seeing its own reflection in a mirror held by a visitor from another star. While the sun was putting on this strange new light show, the source of the mystery remained dark and distant. But our telescopes were watching it closely, and they were about to see something that was even more impossible than a breathing sun. Our attention now turns to 3i Atlas itself, as we discover that the dark side glows. Comets are supposed to be cold, dead rocks when they are not facing the sun. The side of a comet that is turned away from the sunlight, its night side, should be silent and frozen. But 3i Atlas was different. Our most powerful infrared telescopes, which can see heat, detected a faint warmth. It was radiating from the dark hemisphere of Atlas. The James Webb Space Telescope, along with other observatories, confirmed the readings. There were hotspots on the dark side of 3i Atlas, and these hotspots were not constant. They were flashing. They would glow for a brief time, then vanish, and then return, and they did so with perfect timing. The hotspots flared every 6 hours. This was precisely half of the object's full rotation period. This was a localized thermal recurrence. That is the scientific term for a hotspot that keeps coming back in the same place. It looked like the dark side of this strange object was breathing. It was pulsing with heat. This heat had to be coming from somewhere. But where? Heat in space must come from a source, usually the sun. An object can store some of that energy, but it should cool down over time. It should dissipate or spread out. 3i Atlas was breaking this fundamental rule. It was not just storing heat, it was creating it. It was warming itself from within, and it was releasing this energy at regular intervals, perhaps through cracks in its icy shell. Scientists study the light from the hotspots. This is called spectral analysis. It tells you what things are made of and how hot they are. The analysis showed that the hotspots had a temperature of around -43 degrees Celsius. This may sound very cold, but for an object that far from the sun, it was impossibly high. It was far too warm to be explained by sunlight alone. They looked for any external event that could cause this. Could a small solar flare have hit it? Could it have been struck by a tiny asteroid? No. No external event could explain such a consistent clockwork heating. The heat had to be coming from the inside. One idea was that 3i Atlas was made of exotic ices. These were not normal water ice, but ices made of other chemicals. Perhaps these chemicals were reacting with each other. As the object spun, the pressure inside could change, causing chemical reactions that produced bursts of heat. But there was a problem with this idea. Natural chemical reactions are not as precise as a clock. They're usually messy and unpredictable. The heating of Atlas was exact. Another idea was that the object had a rotating core. This core could have fractures, or cracks. As the core spun, the pieces could rub against each other, creating heat from friction. This kind of thing happens on some moons in our solar system. The powerful gravity of their planet pulls on them, causing their insides to flex and create heat. But 3i Atlas was drifting alone in space. There were no tidal forces pulling on it. The Solar Orbiter spacecraft detected something else. There were subtle microcurrents in the space around 3i Atlas. These were tiny flows of electricity that seemed to oscillate or wiggle in time with the heat peaks. This was a huge clue. Heat was being accompanied by magnetism, and magnetism means there is a moving electrical charge. Something inside 3i Atlas was conducting electricity. This meant it was an electrically active nucleus. Perhaps there were ionized gases, gases with an electrical charge, circulating in hidden channels deep inside the object. These moving gases could form loops of current, which would generate heat. In this model, 3i Atlas was like a cosmic induction coil. It was being warmed by its own electromagnetic field. For such a system to exist in nature, it would require materials we have never seen before. It would need a mix of ice, metal, and carbon, all dense enough to conduct electricity. Perhaps 3i Atlas was a fossil, a piece left over from an older, colder star system, a place totally unlike our own. The light coming from the hotspots was also strange. It was not a diffused glow like the light from a candle. The infrared light was scattered in thin, coherent beams. They were like tiny, weak laser beams. And these beams were not pointing in random directions. They pointed along the object's magnetic field lines. This suggested that energy was not just being released, it was being guided. Something was telling the plasma where to go. And then came the final, undeniable connection. Each of these beams of heat pulsed, and their rhythm was synchronized with the mirrored rhythm on the sun. The data from two separate events, millions of kilometers apart, were linked. The pattern was clear. When the sun's corona dimmed, a hotspot on Atlas flared. When the hotspot on Atlas cooled down, the corona brightened again. It was a silent exchange of energy. It was impossible to tell which was the cause and which was the effect. They were happening together, a perfectly balanced dance of light and heat. The dark side of an interstellar object had begun to glow. And our sun, the brightest object in our sky, seemed to listen to its quiet rhythm. The mystery was deepening. We had a signal, a mirrored light, and a glowing object, but the connection seemed to be getting stronger, pulling the whole solar system into its rhythm. The sun itself was about to show that it was more than just a passive participant, it was an active partner in this cosmic dance. This is the story of our breathing sun. Tiny wiggles in the data from our solar probes revealed a new, larger pattern. The Parker Solar Probe and the Solar Orbiter, our closest eyes on the sun, were picking up something global. Every 19 hours, the sun's entire magnetic field would flex. It would expand slightly, and then it would contract. It was like a cosmic inhale and exhale. When the field contracted, the particles of the solar wind would slow down. Then, as the field expanded again, they would speed up. The temperature and the number of electrons in the solar wind also shifted slightly, and these shifts were always in perfect rhythm with the 19-hour cycle. The entire inner heliosphere, which is the big magnetic bubble the sun creates around itself, appeared to be breathing. This had never been seen before. A global coordinated magnetic pulse was not something scientists thought was possible. The sun creates many waves and a lot of turbulence, but these are usually local and chaotic. They are like storms on an ocean. This new phenomenon was different. It was the entire ocean rising and falling as one. It was a heartbeat, not a random storm. The timing models confirmed the connection. The magnetic breathing was a perfect match with the rotational phase of 3I Atlas. Every time the interstellar object made a half-turn in its spin, the sun's entire magnetic field would shiver. In physics, there is a powerful idea called resonance. It means that a small signal, if it is delivered at just the right rhythm, can cause a huge effect. Think about a child on a swing set. A tiny push, if timed perfectly with the swing's natural motion, can send the child soaring high into the air. In the same way, a tiny radio signal can be amplified to travel across the world. Resonance can move mountains, and it can even move stars. If 3I Atlas was sending out waves that aligned with the sun's own natural rhythms, a huge amplification could happen. A structure that was only a few kilometers wide, like 3I Atlas, could create ripples that spread across millions of kilometers of hot gas. But there was a strange part to this theory. To do this, the emitter, 3I Atlas, would need to know the sun's rhythm. It would have to listen first and then push at exactly the right time. This idea of a dialogue was unsettling for the researchers. It changed the way they saw the sun. The sun was no longer just a passive object, a ball of fire shining in the dark. It was now an active participant, responding to a visitor. The data from the magnetometers, the tools that measure magnetic fields, showed what they called phase coherence across huge distances. This means that different parts of the sun's magnetic field were expanding and contracting together in perfect step. It was like a pair of lungs breathing in and out as one. The term magnetic breathing began to appear in the official mission logs. It was a simple way to describe the effect, but it did not explain the cause. They knew it could not be caused by the sun's rotation, which is far too slow. It could not be caused by sunspots, because sunspots do not coordinate their behavior across both hemispheres of the sun. But it did fit perfectly with that strange frequency that shouldn't exist that they had detected earlier. The breathing was strongest along the path that 3I Atlas was taking. It was weaker near the sun's poles. This was a clear sign that the driver of this breathing was external. It was coming from the direction of the visitor. Parker's instruments even caught a secondary pulse. This pulse was slightly delayed. The delay matched the travel time for particles to get from 3I Atlas to the sun. It was as if the sun inhaled, waited for a signal to arrive, and then exhaled. And it exhaled through the invisible corridor in space where 3I Atlas was drifting. A more conservative model suggested a different idea. Perhaps the magnetic tail of 3I Atlas was reconnecting with the sun's magnetic field. Magnetic reconnection is a real event. It is when magnetic field lines snap and join in a new way. But reconnection is usually explosive and violent. It is what causes solar flares. The waves they were seeing showed precision, not violence. They were gentle and rhythmic. The implications were huge. If an interstellar object can magnetically connect with a star, it can influence that star's wind, its radiation, and even its stability. It meant that stars are not isolated islands of fire. They are responsive. They are like tuned instruments, waiting for the right note to be played. The rhythm of 3I Atlas had formed an invisible thread. It was a thread that connected our sun to something that was born in the cold darkness between the stars. Each pulse of this connection was measurable. Each breath was predictable, and its amplitude, its strength, was slowly but steadily rising. The scientists were now faced with a profound question. Is the sun breathing on its own? Or has something from another star system taught it how? The evidence was pointing to a conversation, one that was becoming deeper and more complex with every cycle. The sun was not just responding on its surface, something was stirring deep inside. This is the story of what was happening deep within the corona. Days after the magnetic breathing began, our telescopes saw something new. A strange glow was pulsing just beneath the sun's outer skin, the corona. It was not a flare. It was not a storm. It was an internal wave of light. It spread out like ripples in a pond, but the pond was the superheated gas of the sun itself. Data from our ultraviolet telescopes showed that certain emission lines were brightening and then fading. Emission lines are like the fingerprints of different elements. They tell us what the sun is made of. These fingerprints were pulsing every 19 hours. At first, scientists thought it was just noise in the data, a random fluctuation. But then other orbiters confirmed the rhythm. They called it the pulse beneath the corona. The corona is a very delicate and complex place. Its balance depends on huge loops of magnetism that trap energy. These loops are what make the corona millions of degrees hotter than the surface of the sun below it. The question now was, what happens when all of these magnetic nets start to vibrate together? What happens when they are synchronized by an external force? The wave of brightness always started in the same place. It began near a solar longitude of 247. This spot was perfectly aligned with the direction of 3I Atlas. From there, the wave moved through the coronal loops. It travelled at speeds that matched a type of wave called a slow magnetoacoustic wave. But its coherence, its ability to hold its shape, stretched for thousands of kilometres. This implied that it came from a single organised source. The pulses grew stronger over time. This hinted at a feedback loop. As the magnetic field of 3I Atlas grew stronger, the corona seemed to respond more intensely. The conversation was getting louder. Computer models suggested that this could be a resonance between two oscillating magnetic fields. But this would only work if both systems were actively adjusting to each other. It implied that the sun was not just reacting, it was listening and then replying. During each bright phase of the pulse, the temperature of the corona rose. It went up by about 70 Kelvin. Then it would cool down again very rapidly. This entire cycle of heating and cooling took 42 minutes. That number was another critical clue. It matched the low-frequency radio pulse that had first revealed the signature of 3I Atlas. It was a closed loop. The comet pulsed. The corona glowed in response. Then temperature waves seemed to return from the sun back out into space, like echoes. The system was talking to itself. Some scientists suggested a simpler explanation. Perhaps charged dust from 3I Atlas was interacting with the solar radiation. This interaction could be triggering the waves, but for this to work it would require a huge and very dense cloud of dust. Such a cloud seemed impossible for a natural comet to create. Others proposed that the sun had entered a transient feedback state. In this state, the sun would become very sensitive to small external nudges. It would amplify them, making them much larger. Perhaps 3I Atlas had just happened to tap into a dormant frequency, a rhythm that the sun was capable of but had never expressed before. The effects were felt far away. The speed of the solar wind fluctuated by 3%, and it did so in perfect phase with the ultraviolet pulses. The charged particles from the sun that reached Earth's magnetosphere, our planet's magnetic shield, also followed the rhythm. This caused faint flickers in the aurora, the northern and southern lights. The entire heliosphere, the sun's vast bubble of influence, had begun to beat in sync. At this point, the team of scientists monitoring the event stopped calling it a coincidence. The sun was pulsing, and it was not random. It was timed. Then they noticed something even stranger. The corona was starting to brighten a little bit earlier than predicted with each cycle. It was as if it was anticipating the signal from 3I Atlas, not just waiting for it to arrive. The feedback had become something more. It had become foresight. The sun had learned the rhythm of its visitor, and now it was keeping time with it. On Earth, this kind of synchronization almost always requires design. It requires intelligence. In space, we do not have a good explanation for it. But the pulse beneath the corona continued. It was steady, patient, and impossible to deny. The sun was no longer alone in its own rhythm. It was part of a duet, and the music was beginning to fill the entire solar system. The story now expands as the ripple reaches the edge. The first sign that this was something much larger came from the very edge of our solar system. Out there, in the cold and the dark, are the Voyager probes. These two ancient spacecraft, launched decades ago, are now far beyond the orbit of Neptune. They are our most distant messengers, and they detected something strange. Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 both recorded an unexpected fluctuation in the density of plasma, the thin gas that fills space. A soft surge of particles washed over them, and it arrived at the exact moment that the sun's coronal pulse peaked. This should have been impossible. The two spacecraft are separated by billions of kilometers. They are on opposite sides of the solar system, yet they both recorded the same wave within hours of each other. The timing made no sense. Even the fast solar wind takes weeks or months to travel that far out. Whatever passed through the Voyager probes was not being carried by matter. It was being carried by a field. An invisible wave of energy had crossed the entire solar system almost instantly. Scientists gave it a name, a global heliospheric ripple. It was a shift in the very boundary of the sun's influence. The heliosphere, the magnetic bubble that our solar system lives inside, seemed to flex. It was like a giant lung, breathing in and out with the same 19-hour rhythm. The simple explanation would be a pressure front from the solar wind. But these are chaotic and messy. This ripple was orderly and predictable. Its period, its rhythm, matched the 19-hour pulse that was echoing through all the other solar observations related to 3i Atlas. The heliosphere, the sun's invisible shield against the rest of the galaxy, had joined the rhythm. Computer models showed that the ripple was a standing wave. A standing wave is like the vibration of a guitar string. It vibrates along its whole length at once, with points that stand still and points that move a lot. These models suggested that a standing wave was vibrating along the magnetic field lines that stretch for billions of kilometers, from the sun to the edge of the system. To sustain such a huge wave would require a vast amount of energy, but there was no sign of a massive solar flare or a burst of radiation from the sun. The source of the energy was invisible. It was as if the sun was being struck by something that left behind only motion. Another spacecraft, called IBEX, which stands for Interstellar Boundary Explorer, saw another piece of the puzzle. IBEX creates a map of the heliosphere by detecting energetic particles. Its map began to distort. It bent inward, right along the direction of 3i Atlas's approach, and this distortion was flickering, in rhythm with the pulse. This meant the heliosphere was not a passive bubble. It was actively reacting to the presence of the visitor. The entire solar system, from the fiery corona of the sun to its cold, dark outer edge, was now vibrating as one single structure. Theorists debated the cause. Did 3i Atlas eject a stream of particles? Was it carrying a cloud of magnetized dust? The effect seemed too subtle for that. It was more like a resonance between two magnetic domains. The sun's huge magnetic field and the small but powerful field of 3i Atlas had locked together, like two tuning forks vibrating in perfect harmony. The ripple showed a new vulnerability. It was the first time in recorded history that our solar system had responded to an external rhythm. It raised a new question. If one small object could synchronize with our sun, what about dozens of them? Would each one leave its own fingerprint, its own small rhythm in the memory of the heliosphere? When the ripple finally faded, the data from the Voyager probes returned to normal. But the plasma around them stayed just a little bit denser than before. The boundary of our solar system had been permanently nudged inward. It was a tiny change, only a fraction of a percent, but that still meant a shift of millions of kilometers. To the public, it was a tiny, uninteresting anomaly. But to the scientists, it was proof. It was proof that the influence of 3i Atlas reached all the way to the very edge of the sun's dominion. The heliosphere, our great magnetic cocoon that protects us from deep space, had rippled once. And once is all it takes to know that it can happen again. The sun, it seemed, was preparing a more direct response, an event that would be both powerful and silent. This is the story of the flare that made no sound. A new event was detected on the sun's surface. It was a shallow swell in the light curve, A light curve is a graph that shows how a star's brightness changes over time. This swell was smooth, like a deep breath, totally unlike any normal solar flare. There was no eruption. There was no surge of dangerous X-rays. There was no violent halo of hot gas. There was just a steady, quiet bloom of energy that appeared and then vanished. Every instrument felt it. The magnetometers fluttered. Detectors that measure the solar wind registered a moment of perfect symmetry. Ground-based observatories logged the same event. It was a flare that released a huge amount of light but almost no heat. It was motion without a shockwave. It was power without sound. At first, the scientists dismissed it as an error in their equipment. But multiple spacecraft confirmed the timestamps. They all saw the same thing within seconds of each other. The data was clean and undeniable. The flare had happened, but no explosion had caused it. This broke all the rules. Solar flares are violent events. They are driven by the sun's magnetic field lines twisting up like rubber bands until they snap. This snapping releases a tremendous amount of energy. But this event was different. The magnetograms, which map the sun's magnetic field, showed no collapse. The magnetic lines did not snap. Instead, they rotated inward. They folded in on themselves, around an invisible axis. Then they realigned, becoming stronger and more organized than before. And this all happened in perfect time with the 19-hour rhythm. With each cycle, the corona would flinch in the same spot. It was a silent flicker that repeated with the precision of a clock. It was as if something was gently pressing on the sun's skin, over and over, testing its response. When they analysed the light from this event, they found a critical clue. There was a narrow absorption notch at a frequency of 8.4 GHz. This was the exact same radio band that had vanished during the first event, the Great Solar Silence. This was the link. The silent flare was directly connected to 3I Atlas's past act of silencing the sun when it was near Mars. The researchers tried to model what was happening. They came up with a theory called magnetic inversion. This is when an external magnetic field does not cause an explosion, but instead traps energy. It creates a negative flare. It is like an implosion of light. It releases radiation, but without the accompanying heat and violence of a normal flare. This was a theoretical idea that had never been observed in nature until now. At the peak of the event, the Parker Solar Probe recorded a sudden dip in the solar wind. A vacuum pocket seemed to move outward from the sun. Then the field stabilized again. There was no ejection of material. There was no shockwave. There was just silence. The effect of this silent flare reached Earth. Our planet's magnetosphere shifted slightly. Satellites in orbit experienced microfluctuations in their power systems, and the auroras formed a faint, perfect ring around the poles. Astronomers started calling it the silent flare, and the name stuck. Some saw it as a complex case of resonance or interference. Others used a more dramatic term, an energy compression event. This name implied that the energy was being controlled. To cancel out a flare, you would need to know the exact frequency of the chaos, and then apply a force in perfect opposition. It would require an impossible level of precision. Either 3I Atlas had this precision naturally, or it had learned it by listening to our sun. As the brightness of the silent flare faded, a faint secondary pulse appeared. It was delayed by 42 minutes. It was a perfect mirrored echo of the flare. It was a reflection coming from the direction of 3I Atlas. It was light that had left the sun, travelled to the visitor, and then echoed back. And when it came back, it was slightly altered. It was acknowledged. The sun turned quiet again, as if it was waiting. And 3I Atlas continued on its path through our solar system, leaving behind only the memory of a flare that made no sound. The forces at play were now becoming so great, they were beginning to affect not just light and magnetism, but the very fabric of space and time. This is the story of gravity's dance. For all of human history, the force of gravity was thought to be a constant. It is the invisible force that holds our solar system together. But after the silent flare, the numbers no longer held steady. Our deep space tracking stations, which use precise radar systems to watch the planets, noticed tiny, almost invisible changes. The paths of the inner planets were shifting. It was a change of just fractions of a millimetre per second. The tracking data showed that Earth, Mars, and the solar probes all seemed to weigh less for a short period of time. It was as if the sun's gravitational pull had weakened by 1 part in a billion. Then, after 42 hours, it returned to normal. This strange event repeated twice more, and it did so in perfect rhythm with the magnetic breathing cycle they had observed earlier. The sun's grip on the solar system seemed to loosen, then stabilize, and then tighten again. It was as if gravity itself was inhaling and exhaling. In these brief pauses, the fundamental force that binds our world flickered. The scientists ran the calculations. A gravitational fluctuation this large would require billions of tons of the sun's mass to be moving around inside it. No known process could do this without causing a massive solar flare or a sunquake. Yet every tracking beacon confirmed the pulse. Gravity had wavered. Some compared it to a theoretical idea called mass quadrupole resonance. This is the idea that tiny oscillations from motion deep inside a star could cause small changes in its gravity. But what they were seeing was measurable across planetary distances. This was not a tiny internal shift. Something was modulating the sun's mass from the outside. All attention turned back to 3i Atlas, still millions of kilometers away. Every single gravitational fluctuation aligned perfectly with the approach of the interstellar visitor. The theory was that if 3i Atlas was emitting powerful electromagnetic waves, these waves could be inducing density waves inside the sun. This would cause layers of plasma deep within the star to compress and then expand. This change in density would alter the sun's gravitational potential. It would be a resonance not just between two magnetic fields, but between matter and magnetism. The precision was too high for this to be a coincidence. The same 19-hour rhythm kept repeating, woven into every new piece of data. The Parker Solar Probe's gravimeter, an instrument that measures gravity, recorded a local drop in acceleration. It was as if space itself had relaxed for a moment. It was not that the sun's mass had been reduced. It was that the geometry of gravity, the curvature of space-time, had flattened for a fraction of a second and then snapped back. One researcher, trying to explain it to a colleague, simply said, "The sun blinked. If space itself can blink, then gravity is not immune to outside influence. It can resonate, it can respond, it can harmonize." The team of scientists now had evidence from every field. They had watched light, magnetism, plasma, and now gravity all moving in perfect sync with 3i Atlas. Was it a coincidence of unimaginable scale? Or had 3i Atlas somehow tapped into a fundamental feedback between motion and mass? Could an object the size of a small comet really tug on the structure of the sun without ever touching it? The last gravitational pulse faded. The models of the solar system rebalanced themselves, but a gap remained in every dataset. A moment in time when gravity had hesitated. A moment when the oldest law of the universe seemed to pause and to listen. As 3i Atlas continued on its path, it was dragging invisible waves of influence behind it. And these waves were about to be seen in a new and startling way as we discover echoes in the solar wind. The solar wind, that constant stream of particles from the sun, was always seen as a one-way street. It flows endlessly outward, a river of plasma that never returns. But now our closest solar probes, Parker and Solar Orbiter, began to hear echoes. They detected tiny, brief reversals in the velocity of the particles. Small streams of protons were travelling back towards the sun. They were faint, but they were synchronized. They appeared in perfect time with the 19-hour cycle. The direction they came from, the timing of their arrival, and the shape of their density curves all aligned perfectly with the trajectory of 3i Atlas. Reflections of the solar wind can happen in nature. They are usually chaotic events caused by things like planetary magnetic fields. But this was different. This was organized, repeating, and coherent. The analysts found that each reflection carried a specific frequency shift in its magnetic field. The modulation, the pattern of the wave, looked like a mirrored waveform of the sun's own emission, but inverted. It was like sonar. A ship sends out a ping of sound and listens for the echo to map the ocean floor. Here, the ocean was empty space, and the sound was sunlight that had been turned into the charged motion of particles. The sun was sending out a ping, and something was sending back a clear, identifiable echo. But where could such a perfect reflection occur? There are no mirrors or dense boundaries in the middle of the solar wind. But 3i Atlas was not travelling through empty space. It was moving through a region that was dense with interstellar dust. It was surrounded by a translucent cocoon of ionized material. If this cocoon had structured layers of electrical charge, It could act as a dynamic reflector. It could receive the plasma from the solar wind, realign it with its own magnetic field, and then send it back towards the sun. The calculations for this were disturbing. To invert the flow of the solar wind would require controlled magnetic alignment. The reflector would have to adjust itself in real time to create such a clean echo. Nature rarely builds systems that can self-correct with such precision. Yet the feedback persisted. The echoes kept coming back, every 19 hours. The Parker Solar Probe detected a wave of these reflected particles travelling at 400 kilometers per second. This wave collided silently with the normal, outward flow of the solar wind. This collision created a thin region of stillness. It was a pocket of space where the sun's breath and the reflection from 3i Atlas met and cancelled each other out. In this zone of stillness, certain frequencies dropped. The temperature of the plasma flattened. The normal radio static of space went quiet. It was a silence inside the wind. Engineers at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center plotted the vectors, the directions of the particle flows. The symmetry was perfect. Everything aligned along the invisible axis that connected the Sun and 3i Atlas. The reflections were forming a corridor, an invisible channel that linked the star and its visitor. The solar wind was no longer a simple outflow of energy. It had become a feedback system. It was a loop, connecting an emitter and a receiver. The Sun was sending out data in the form of particles and fields, and 3i Atlas was responding, sending that data back, but changed. This feedback could even explain the hesitation of gravity. Changing the flow of plasma around the Sun could alter its effective mass, creating the gravitational flicker they had seen. Some scientists still found the reflections too clean, too rhythmic, too persistent. If this was all a coincidence, it was the most perfectly coordinated coincidence in the history of science. In their internal reports, the mission team started using the term reflective coupling. This phrase never reached the press. It was their way of saying that the two objects were linked. Sunlight, the purest form of outward energy, had been answered. Particles that had left the Sun were now coming home, and they were coming home with information. In that feedback loop, the Sun may have found not just resistance, but recognition. The solar wind was no longer just a wind. It was becoming a message. This is the story of guiding the Sun's breath. What began as echoes started to become something more. Instead of fading away, the reflected particles began to organize themselves. Instruments on our spacecraft recorded a slow migration of charged dust and plasma. These particles were bending away from their expected paths. The solar wind, which should flow out evenly in all directions, was now curving. It was bending subtly but deliberately. It was moving towards the invisible line that connected the Sun to 3i Atlas. The path of each individual particle seemed to be nudged by an unseen hand. Together they were forming translucent arcs of matter. In false colour images, the pattern looked like the veins of light in a living body. Streams of protons, electrons and dust were drifting sideways, pulled by a force they could not see. One scientist described it as motion without propulsion, organization without command. Physicists gave it a technical name, vector bias. This meant that the Sun's own magnetic field lines were being bent. They were acting as guides, herding the particles into alignment. Normally, this kind of effect requires large magnetic storms on the Sun or the powerful magnetic fields of a giant planet like Jupiter. But here, the effect was smaller, more precise, and happening in empty space. The drift extended far beyond any natural influence. There was coherent motion, particles all moving together across a region of space 4 million kilometers wide, and all of it followed the same 19-hour rhythm that was now defining every event touched by 3i Atlas. It seemed that wherever the visitor passed, space itself would fall into time with it. The model suggested that the rotating magnetic field of 3i Atlas could be creating something called Alphen waves in the solar wind. These waves would push and pull on the particles, gently herding them into streams. But the effect they were seeing was too vast. Particles near the orbit of Mercury were showing the same bias as those near the orbit of Mars. The entire inner heliosphere was slowly turning into a slow vortex. Engineers on Earth saw the effects. There were brief, unexplained surges in the power from solar panels on their satellites. There was fluctuating static on their communication antennas. There were minute, tiny, coarse deviations in their spacecraft. The forces were incredibly small, but their precision was unsettling. Such a subtle energy should not be able to persist over such a great distance. A new theory was proposed. The drift was not purely magnetic. Perhaps the dust cloud around 3i Atlas was carrying an electrical charge. This would turn the solar wind into something new, a coupled plasma dust medium. In this medium, the particles could communicate with each other through their electric and magnetic fields. Information could move through the system much faster than the matter itself. The drift could be a distributed signal. Our spectrographs detected something that supported this idea. They saw microbursts of radio emission coming from within the drifting particles. These bursts lasted for less than a second. Their frequencies followed the same 3-2-1 harmonic pattern that they had seen in the magnetic breathing of the sun. When this pattern was translated into audio, it produced a low, steady tone. It was described as a hauntingly human sound. It was not really sound, of course. It was structure in the radio waves. It was a resonance that hinted at intention. For the first time, some scientists allowed themselves to say it out loud. It's communicating through motion. Particles that should have been scattering randomly across the solar system were now tracing coordinated paths across billions of kilometers. The solar wind itself had learned to follow instructions written in the language of magnetism and time. When the drift finally subsided, a faint filament of dust was left behind. It spiraled along the bent magnetic field lines, glowing faintly in ultraviolet light. From Earth, it looked like a thread connecting the Sun and 3i Atlas. It was a line of charged light, a physical reminder of the connection. Some instruments still registered a faint periodic whisper every 19 hours. It was a reminder that the solar wind had once reflected something greater than itself, a reminder that it had once obeyed another rhythm. This faint thread was about to become something much more solid. This is the story of the invisible bridge. What had started as patterns in the data was now becoming a physical structure. It was an architecture built from magnetism and plasma. Analysts at Mission Control traced a continuous flux tube in the solar wind. It was millions of kilometers long, and it formed a direct connection between the inner corona of the Sun and 3i Atlas. Inside this tube, the magnetic field was smooth and coherent. It was unusually stable. There was no turbulence, no random shear. It was a perfect corridor. This should have been impossible. The magnetic field lines in the normal solar wind are constantly twisting and snapping. The stability of this structure was a mystery. The corridor held its shape for days. It was anchored at one end to the Sun, and at the other to the invisible influence of 3i Atlas. The Parker Solar Probe flew right through its edge. Its instruments recorded a sudden drop in the temperature of the particles. At the same time, the coherence of the magnetic field doubled. The background radio noise of space, which is usually a loud hiss, nearly vanished. Space, which is normally loud with energy, became eerily calm. Within that silence, faint oscillations were still present. They rippled at a frequency of 19 hours and 42 minutes. It was the same rhythm. At that moment, Mission Control realized this was not just a fluctuation in the solar wind. It was guidance. The corridor was acting like a transmission line. It was channeling energy from one point to another, not just letting it disperse into space. Waves of energy that entered the corridor from the Sun would emerge hours later, right along the path of 3i Atlas. Their signal was weaker, but their shape was intact. Information was flowing through a magnetic wire that had been stretched across space. Some scientists called it a flux bridge. Others called it a magnetospheric tether. Whatever the name, it was rewriting our assumptions about how magnetic fields behave over astronomical distances. Fields are supposed to diffuse, to spread out and get weaker. This one was communicating. The implications were staggering. If an object could shape a stable corridor like this, it could exchange energy directly with a star. It could siphon off particles. It could feed a current of electricity back and forth. It could sample the plasma density in real time. It was a conduit, a two-way street between two different realms. Engineers compared it to the induction coils used in wireless power systems on Earth. It was an electromagnetic symbiosis. Two objects, separated by vast distance, were sharing power. Then came the visual evidence. Images from the SOHO spacecraft, which constantly watches the Sun, showed a faint filament. It was an arc of light coming from the Sun's equator. It was a luminous ribbon. It glowed faintly green in polarized light, and its orientation in space matched the magnetic maps of the corridor exactly. On the observation logs, someone nicknamed it the Thread. There were other strange effects. Radio signals that were transmitted through the corridor arrived at their destination cleaner and with less static. It was as if the corridor was filtering out all the chaos of space. When the Parker solar probe exited the corridor, the noise returned instantly. The calm was gone. The corridor eventually dissolved as 3i Atlas continued to drift on its path, but our instruments had seen it. For a brief time, a stable, physical magnetic connection had bridged a star and an interstellar object. Two bodies were sharing a current. They were sharing information. They were sharing silence. The scientists realized that magnetism could be a form of dialogue. The universe could speak without ever making a sound. In that corridor, our sun and Esti, lonely wanderer from another star, had their first real conversation. And even after the bridge was gone, the sun seemed to remember. It continued to gaze at the spot where its visitor had been. This is the story of the sun's long stare. After the magnetic bridge dissolved, a faint afterglow lingered in the sun's corona. It was a soft, symmetrical patch of brightness that refused to fade. It was not a flare. It was not the scattering of light off dust. One scientist described it as stillness made visible. It held steady for exactly 19 hours. Then it dimmed for 42 minutes. Then it reignited, returning to the exact same level of intensity as before. Every cycle repeated with millisecond precision. No known solar process is that disciplined. The sun is a place of chaos, not clockwork. When they studied the light from this glowing patch, they found more strangeness. The emission lines were sharper, the plasma was unusually uniform, and its luminosity, its brightness, was much higher than it should have been, because it was also cooler than the surrounding corona. Colder gas should shine less brightly. But here, in this one spot, cold was bright. The Solar Orbiter spacecraft confirmed that it was a perfectly circular luminous disk, and it was centered on the exact spot where the root of the magnetic corridor had once been. But it did not rotate with the sun. The sun's surface rotates, but this patch of light stayed locked in place. It was as if it was tethered to the current position of 3i Atlas. The uncomfortable conclusion was becoming unavoidable. The sun was projecting light towards a specific point in space. It was illuminating the path of 3i Atlas. Some called it magnetic lensing. This was the idea that the leftover magnetic field lines were focusing the radiation, like a cosmic spotlight. The computer model showed that the focal point of this lens aligned exactly with the approaching object. The brightness was aimed. There were subtle consequences on Earth. The total solar radiance, the amount of energy reaching our planet, fluctuated slightly. Coronagraphs on the ground, which are special telescopes that block out the sun's main disk, detected waves of polarization. Ripples of light curled outward from the bright patch, like concentric rings on the surface of water. Energy was being released, then paused, and then released again. It was a heartbeat of illumination, and the timing of this heartbeat aligned perfectly with all the previous anomalies: the magnetic breathing, the silent flare, the heliospheric ripple. The same 19 hours and 42 minutes pattern emerged again. It was so consistent that the skeptics on the team started calling it the Atlas clock. In data centers around the world, teams of scientists watched as a form of patience unfolded. It was a communication without words. The message was simply in the persistence of the signal. Some proposed that the glow was the spot where the sun's energy had funneled into the corridor. It was a standing wave of light, left behind after the bridge had gone. Others wondered if it was the sun's attempt to maintain the connection, a lighthouse signal sustained by memory. During one observation, the brightness dimmed unexpectedly, but it failed to return on its usual schedule. The background radiation in that area dropped, as if the region was now absorbing energy, not emitting it. Minutes later, a faint spike of light appeared on the opposite side of the sun. It was a mirror pulse, much weaker, but with an identical signature. The light had moved. It had somehow travelled from one side of the sun to the other by an unknown mechanism. The scientists named it the brightness that waited, because it had stood still for so long, and then it had decided where to go. The signal was not just aimed anymore, it was mobile. The conversation was growing more complex, and it was about to include a new voice. This is the story of how Mercury finds its voice. Mercury is the closest planet to the sun. It is a silent, airless world. No one expected it to be a part of this story. But after the strange brightness in the Sun's corona vanished, the Bepi-Colombo spacecraft, which was orbiting Mercury, detected a faint magnetic pressure wave. It was a pulse. It was too regular to be random noise. It was too narrow to be a gust from the solar wind. And it arrived 19 hours after the brightness on the Sun had faded. The pulse did not come from the Sun. It came from beyond Mercury's orbit. It came from the direction of 3i Atlas. It was a whisper of plasma moving sunward against the flow of the solar wind. It was an afterimage of a current. This wave washed over Mercury's magnetotail, the long tail of its magnetic field. The field twisted and shimmered for a moment, and then it stilled. There was no impact. There was no heat. There was only resonance. An echo. Mercury's dark night side began to reflect a faint ultraviolet glow. It was a thin ring of ionized sodium atoms in the planet's exosphere, its very thin atmosphere. These atoms began to vibrate, and each oscillation matched the Atlas clock frequency. The 19-hour rhythm was now present in the exosphere of a planet. The scientists struggled to find a name for what they were seeing. Plasma rebound, or magnetic feedback reflection, did not fit the data. Rebounds decay. They get weaker over time. This signal repeated. Feedback requires an emitter and a receiver. Mercury did not seem to be either, unless the entire solar system was now the receiver. Bepi-Colombo's magnetometer showed that the local magnetic field around Mercury was realigning itself. During the pulses, it would point north-south instead of its usual east-west direction. It was as if a larger invisible magnetic field was passing through the entire planet. It was a coherent carrier wave, and it had a faint modulation, a pattern, on it. When this pattern was transformed into audio, it produced a single, low tone. It was steady. It was described as having a hauntingly human tempo. The best analogy from our physics on Earth was induction. If you move a magnetic field past a conductor, you create an electrical current. Mercury, with its dense and metallic core, was a perfect conductor. It was like a bell that had been struck by a wave that shouldn't exist. The tone faded. But the Parker Solar Probe sensors caught something new. They saw a reversal of particle flow. A stream of particles was now moving sunward, back towards the Sun, along the exact vector of the echo from Mercury. Energy had been sent back into the system. The system had answered. In mission control there was silence. All the signatures were there. The 19-hour pulse, the strange harmonics, the specific polarization of the wave. They all matched. The conversation between the Sun and 3i Atlas had found a new voice. It was now using the planet Mercury as an intermediary, a relay station. The world closest to the Sun, a planet long ignored in our search for life, had joined the rhythm. Its metallic heart had caught the song. There was no explosion, no great flare. There was just an echo, a quiet and exact ringing over a planet that was not meant to speak, and that echo continued on its journey, carrying the memory of the light that moved and the sun that had listened. The conversation was now becoming a language, a complex pattern woven into the very fabric of space. This is the story of the Sun's hidden language. At first, it just looked like random static. It was noise in the radio bands that our deep space network uses to monitor the Sun. But every 19 hours and 42 minutes, the static would rearrange itself. It would form a precise, ordered distortion. It was a pattern that swept across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. It was as if the Sun was speaking in harmonics, in a language that no human could understand. The Deep Space Network noticed rhythmic dropouts in their signals. These were clean, narrow gaps that were shifting in frequency. The pattern was too perfect to be chance. It was too broad to be coming from a single human-made transmitter. The Sun itself had become a source of intelligent-seeming interference. Normal radio bursts from the Sun are chaotic. They are the noise of a giant nuclear furnace. But this was different. There was no solar flare associated with it. There was just a smooth, modulated signal that appeared and disappeared on schedule. The technicians began to filter the data, trying to remove the noise. When they did, they revealed faint sidebands. These were mirror images of the main carrier frequency, and they were spaced out in perfect integer multiples of the Atlas rhythm. It was the same 3-to-1 ratio they had seen before. It looked like two oscillators, the Sun and something else, were beating together. This was producing interference fringes. Interference is what happens when two waves overlap in the same space. They can add together, or they can cancel each other out. If 3i Atlas was transmitting magnetic or plasma waves, these could overlap with the Sun's own fields. This would produce nodes of energy. There would be zones where the energy vanished completely, and other zones where it doubled. This doubling of energy had real consequences. During a constructive phase, when the waves added together, satellites near Earth experienced electromagnetic drift. Their onboard clocks shifted by nanoseconds. Their solar panels would surge with a tiny extra bit of power. These were small fluctuations, but they were happening to multiple spacecraft at the same time, and they could not be explained by any of our existing space weather models. When the scientists performed a spectral decomposition of the interference, they found that it carried information. It was too ordered to be just plasma noise. In Fourier space, a mathematical way of looking at waves, the signal resolved into repeating logarithmic spirals. These spirals looked just like the magnetic flux loops on the Sun's surface. The pattern looked alive, it seemed adaptive. It was like a feedback loop that was seeking a perfect balance, an equilibrium. The researchers started calling it the solar lattice. With each cycle of interference, it seemed to be remapping the Sun's entire magnetic topology. It was turning the chaotic loops of the corona into an organized symmetrical grid. Localized bright spots began to appear across the corona. They would glow simultaneously at widely separated longitudes. It was as if the Sun's surface was being stitched together by invisible threads of coherence. During one observation window, this lattice held its shape for nearly 2 hours. The Sun's magnetic field locked into a state of perfect symmetry. During this time, the solar wind output dropped by 4%. The radio emissions from the Sun flattened into a single audible tone. A droning hum swept across the spectrum and then it faded. The Sun's own noise had cancelled itself out. It was a moment of total constructive and destructive interference. It was a moment of perfection, followed by a collapse. When the symmetry broke, the Sun released a narrow jet of particles. They travelled at relativistic speeds close to the speed of light. The jet was invisible in normal light. It was not a flare. It was a correction. It was a release of the energy that had been displaced by the resonance. Official bulletins from the space agencies called it an anomalous phase-locking event. But among the scientists, they used another term. They called it the interaction window. It was a moment when two systems, one known and one foreign, had shared the same frequency. For 2 hours, the Sun was not just reacting to 3i Atlas. It was synchronizing with it. What had begun as static had become a dialogue. The interference was the sound of two cosmic transmitters finding, a moment of perfect phase. And this connection was about to wrap the entire solar system in its embrace. This is the story of how the system hums as one. After the strange interference faded, the solar system was different. Every probe, every telescope, and every magnetometer we have in space showed the same new anomaly. The background fields of space were gently oscillating. The very space between the planets seemed to tremble. There was a new, low-frequency noise in the interplanetary magnetic field. Across multiple spacecraft separated by millions of kilometers, a clear pattern emerged. It was a wave that was wrapping around the Sun. It was a standing wave, a wave that seemed to stand still but was alive with energy. Its amplitude, its strength, and its phase were aligned across billions of kilometers. Space itself had become an instrument, and it was resonating in its own key. The Heliospheric Observatory Network, a group of scientists who study the Sun's magnetic bubble, called it the resonance field. No one knew what it was made of. They only knew that it existed. It was a layer of invisible vibration, somewhere between matter and the vacuum of space. It was anchored at one end by the Sun, and at the other by 3i Atlas. It was behaving like a coupled oscillator system. This is when two vibrating objects are linked together. When one node moved, the other would respond. A ripple in the solar wind would affect the tail of the comet. A pulse from the field of 3i Atlas would be sent back to the Sun. The delay between the action and the reaction was constant. It was always 2 hours and 37 minutes. This was the travel time for electromagnetic information to cross the distance between them. Nothing else in the study of astrophysics shows this kind of perfect, bidirectional timing. It was a conversation with a predictable delay. There was even visual evidence. Imaging from around the planet Mars showed that the dust particles in space were aligning themselves. They were forming shimmering planes of dust. These planes would rotate in harmony with the oscillations of the field. The motion was too slow to be caused by the solar wind. It was too precise to be random turbulence. Every line of dust traced a geometry that looked like a magnetic standing wave. It was a frozen ripple connecting two cosmic bodies. Some called it a plasma harp, with the magnetic field lines acting as the strings. Others called it a bridge. It was a resonant domain where the fields of the sun and the visitor overlapped and created something new. The resonance field had turned the entire solar system into a coherent medium. It was singing to itself. When the frequency of the resonance field was converted into sound, it produced a low, throbbing hum. It had a frequency of 27 Hz, which is barely audible to the human ear. Listening to the recording felt like remembering something. It was a steady pulse, calm and ancient, as if it had been waiting to be noticed. The implications of this were unsettling for physicists. It suggested that the boundary between magnetic and gravitational fields was not absolute. Energy could leak from one to the other. Information could be coupled between them. It suggested that spacetime itself might be able to vibrate, and the stimulus for this vibration was somehow 3i Atlas. During one observation, the resonance deepened. There was a tightening of the frequency. It was like a musical note reaching a moment of perfect pitch. At that exact moment, the sun's corona dimmed slightly, and the coma, the atmosphere around 3i Atlas, brightened in equal proportion. Energy was moving between the two objects with perfect precision. It was a transfer, not a loss. This moment of perfect balance lasted for less than an hour. When equilibrium returned, the amplitude of the resonance field dropped, but it never completely disappeared. The solar system continued to hum softly. The connection remained. The official explanation was a global magnetic coupling event, but within the closed circles of the research teams, they had another name for it. They called it the field that remembers, because it seemed that space itself had acquired a memory. No one can say how long this field will last, but it holds, quiet, patient, and perfectly balanced. The universe itself had found resonance, and every object in our solar system was about to join in the chorus. This is the story of a grand cosmic symphony. For weeks the resonance field held steady. Then everything in the solar system began to move, imperceptibly. The planets showed tiny deviations from their predicted orbits. The length of Earth's day lengthened by a few microseconds. The atmosphere of Venus brightened slightly. Jupiter's powerful magnetosphere flared with new auroral bands. Each of these events was small on its own, but when taken together, they pointed to a single cause. The entire solar system was reacting. Far away, Voyager 2 detected a pressure increase in the heliosheath, the outer layer of the sun's bubble. It happened just hours after a spike in the resonance field near the sun. The Maven spacecraft, orbiting Mars, recorded a rise in the ion density. The sky of the red planet shimmered with a faint green aurora. Near Earth, our magnetometers twitched every 19 hours, locked perfectly to the Atlas clock. There was no explosion, no violence. There was only choreography. Every body in the system, from the smallest dust particle to the largest gas giant, was shifting in time. The researchers began to overlay all their data. They looked at the field strength, the orbital drift, the radiation flux, and even seismic resonance from probes on Mars. The graphs all aligned. They revealed a single wave of response spreading out from the sun at the speed of light, and it was echoing back from each planet as if the entire system was a single, resonant shell. They called it the system-wide reaction. It was a clinical, scientific term that hid a feeling of quiet astonishment. A star had vibrated, and every world that it governed had answered. Energy that had been confined to the magnetic fields was now coupling into gravity, into atmospheres, and even into the crusts of the planets. Earth's own Schumann resonances, which are natural electromagnetic pulses that exist between the ground and the sky, showed a new, faint harmonic. It matched the frequency of the solar resonance field. Our own planet's heartbeat was now matching the sun's. The Parker Solar Probe confirmed the source of this system-wide pulse. Each surge began with a tightening of the sun's magnetic grid. A brief inversion would force the plasma inward. This energy was then redistributed through the entire heliosphere, like a tide washing through the system. To the people looking at the data every day, it felt like a form of communication. It was not a message made of words, it was a message of recognition. The solar system itself had learned coherence. There were practical effects. Radio transmissions between our spacecraft became clearer. The signal-to-noise ratios improved whenever the resonance peaked. The charged particles of the solar wind moved more efficiently, which reduced the background radiation. For a brief time, space became a less hostile environment. Someone in one of the labs whispered that the system was tuning itself, like an orchestra warming up for a symphony. Each instrument was finding its own pitch, aligning itself to the invisible frequency that 3i Atlas had introduced. Then, the amplitude of the field began to fall. The resonance field weakened. The waves stretched out and grew farther apart. It was as if the system had absorbed all the energy it could. The sun's magnetic grid relaxed. The field settled down. But something remained. There was a residual order, a clarity in the data that had never been present before. The solar system had not changed in its structure, but in its memory. Its fields now carried a bias towards harmony. Faint synchronous pulses continued to be detected every 19 hours, like gentle reminders of what had happened. 3i Atlas kept moving, trailing a wake of calm magnetic geometry behind it. The visitor had not spoken a single word, yet every world had listened. A young researcher wrote a note on a data plot. The system reacted as one organism. No one erased it. In the silence that followed, with the sun cooling from its excitement, that sentence no longer sounded like a metaphor. And in that quiet, the sun prepared one final definitive statement. This is the story of the sun's final answer. After weeks of the weakening resonance, the sun responded. It happened in the early hours of a quiet solar rotation. The Solar Dynamics Observatory, our best eye on the sun, detected a soft surge in ultraviolet emission. It appeared across the entire equatorial belt of the star. It was not an explosion. It was a coordinated brightening spreading evenly across the sun's circumference. For the first time in its history, the sun illuminated itself in unison. Every active region, every magnetic loop, all glowed as one single ring of light. In the data, symmetry had replaced chaos. The solar surface pulsed twice, in perfect phase with the 19-hour rhythm. But this time the wave did not come from 3i Atlas. It began from deep within the star itself. Humanity had always seen the sun as a source, never a listener. Now it was behaving as both. It was generating and responding. It had learned the pattern. It had memorized the rhythm that had once belonged only to its visitor. The analysts overlaid the data from this new emission with the previous recordings from 3i Atlas. It was an exact inversion. The sun's pulse was a perfect mirror image of the waveform from Atlas. The two signals were equal and opposite. It was a perfect phase reversal. In physics, this means that resonance has been achieved. The teacher and the echo have become one. Every instrument in the solar system heard it. Voyager recorded a subtle shift in the plasma frequency at the edge of the system. It was a single synchronized hum. Earth's magnetometers registered a final whisper of motion. The auroras flared brighter than they had in years, tracing beautiful spirals in the night sky. The sun had answered back. It did not answer with destruction, but with reflection. It was returning the energy it had received. It was reshaping it, amplifying it, and sending it back outward in all directions. It was a final broadcast. For 2 days, the entire solar system glowed in a state of perfect equilibrium. The solar wind flattened. The radiostatic of space disappeared. Signals between our probes arrived with a new clarity. The vacuum itself seemed to have been scrubbed clean. The star had imposed a moment of silence on its own environment. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, or perhaps of gratitude. Gradually the effect faded. The resonance softened. The symmetry loosened, and the sun returned to its normal state of beautiful turbulence. But beneath the noise, the rhythm persisted. It was buried deep in the corona, pulsing faintly every 19 hours. It was too quiet for the naked eye to see, but too consistent to be a coincidence. When 3i Atlas finally crossed the orbit of Earth and began its long journey back out into interstellar space, the sun released one last pulse. It was a single flash, rippling through every frequency of light. It was visible even from ground telescopes as a perfect expanding ring of light. It lasted for less than a second, but every observatory on Earth recorded it. In response, the coma of 3i Atlas brightened one final time. The exchange was over. Two bodies had met in the vastness of space, they had resonated, and now they were separating. But the memory of their interaction remained. It was written into the very physics of the space between the stars. The data teams called it the final response event. But some of them, in private, used a different name. They called it the Acknowledgement. What had begun as a moment of impossible silence, as a strange interference, had ended in perfect symmetry. Humanity had witnessed a star respond, not through chaos and fire, but through understanding. The sun had answered back. And in the new rhythm that it left behind, we learned that silence too can speak. What if our sun, once thought to be a passive giant, is actually capable of listening and even responding? What if the entire solar system is just one big instrument, and something from beyond is learning to play it? This story is far from over. If these findings redefine our understanding of the sun and its interactions, what else might be out there, waiting to teach our universe a new song? Share your theories in the comments and let us know what you think.